Hello, everybody. My RT230s, what is happening? Welcome to Mr. Takazon's channel here on YouTube. And we're going to delve right in and do a chapter 1, which is titled, I Like My Compliance Raw, because we're going to be dealing with static compliance and airway resistance. Now, for some strange reason, Pilbeams introduces dynamic compliance in chapter 8, but I have reviewed that in class, so keep dynamic compliance in the back burner, so when we do a chapter 8, you guys can go ahead and utilize that knowledge that you already possess. So let's delve right in and let's talk about ventilation versus respiration. Okay, so now we have some terms here that we got to define. First and foremost, it's spontaneous ventilation. That's just basically the air movement into and out of lungs. That's it. Respiration, you're talking about the gas exchange. You're talking about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between an organism and its environment. Okay, now with respiration, there are two components. You have external and internal, where external respiration deals with the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. So think of external respiration as looking at your AA gradient. Okay, now for an internal respiration, it's dealing with cellular level movements of oxygen from the blood into the cells. Okay, so those are the different types of respiration. Now, when we talk about breathing, we're talking about muscles. And we have accessory muscles that help us breathe. And you start to see the accessory muscles work overtime when you have increased work of breathing. So as of now, if you're looking at the muscles of inspiration, you have your scalenes, sternocleidomastoids, pecs, and your traps. Now you're looking at upper back and some shoulder. Okay, so you're looking at more upper body. You have your chest, you have your traps. So that's going to pull on the rib cage to elevate it. So when you're looking at expiration, notice that you're looking at rectus abdominis, oblique. So you're looking more at abs. Okay, and so it's the abs that help push out that air so that we can breathe out our carbon dioxide. And you might have read in the text they call it the respiratory pump, and that's dealing with the inspiration and expiration muscles. Okay, so as we continue, we talk about gas flow and pressure gradients. Now we're going to need pressure to help move air in and out of our lungs, but there are different pressures located throughout the body. And so with these pressures, they cause different gradients to help move the pressures from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Okay, so if I have a lot of pressure atmospherically and I have low pressures in my alveoli, guess what? That pressure is going to move from the outside external environment going into my alveoli. And as pressure starts to decrease, my volumes start to increase. And I don't know if you guys remember Boyle's law, but that's basically it. When pressure increases, your volume decreases, and vice versa. If your volume increases, your pressure decreases. I hope I said that right. All right, so yeah, there's that inverse relationship between pressure and volume. Okay, so when we're talking about the different units of measure, and normally when we talk about pressures, we deal with millimeters of mercury, and with mechanical ventilation, you'll be seeing more of centimeters of water pressure. Okay, but here's an interesting thing. You can tell who are old school instructors because when they give blood gases, it's not millimeters of mercury. It'll say 7.25 torr. All right, so torr and millimeters of mercury, same thing. Okay, so here are some pressure equivalents that you may or may not really see as much, but it's there. Are you going to convert in the NBRC exam? I don't think so. So I think just remember for me, I remember looking at 1 torr equals 1 millimeters of mercury. You have the kPa, which is a kilopascal. Okay, one of those gives you 7.5. Now, the very bottom, 1 atmosphere equals 760 millimeters of mercury. 760 millimeters of mercury looks familiar to you guys. It should, because I believe you use that in your AA gradient. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, because that's more of a 210 concept. So I tend to forget more of the concepts that don't deal with mechanical ventilation directly. So correct me if I'm wrong in the comments section. So here are our different pressures. So our first one's an airway opening pressure. Now, holy cow, you have another 5 names for the stinking airway opening pressure. Am I going to test you on all the names? No. Okay, so just know that your mouth, all right, your pie hole has a pressure, okay? And then the other one is at body surface. So you have some type of atmospheric pressure pushing against your rib cage, your body surface, and that kind of affects your expansion of the lungs. Okay, so you'll possibly have pressures internally inside the pleural cavity, the pleural space, as well as you will have pressures exerting against the lungs, and then you'll have pressures exerting against your whole entire body, which is your body surface pressure. Okay, intrapleural pressure. Now, if we break down the word intra, meaning between, pleural, now you have your parietal and visceral pleurae. So it's that pressure in between those layers that exerts a pressure. Now you'll see here it says it's about -5 centimeters of water at the end of exhalation and -10 centimeters at the inspiration. There is a diagram in chapter 1 that is on the slides that I'll show you, and it kind of reveals a little bit of that, but we'll see that later on in the slides. And last but not least, you have alveolar pressure, or your intrapulmonary pressure. Okay, so it's the same thing. So once you see intrapulmonary, think alveolar pressure. Okay, so when we talk about that, we're dealing with a +1 and a -1 during exhalation and inspiration. Okay, now we have 4 basic pressure gradients. Again, a gradient is where pressure moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Okay, so first one is a trans-airway pressure, and that is dealing with the airway opening, your pie hole, and the alveolus. So from your mouth all the way down to your alveoli, that is your trans-airway pressure. Okay, your other one is your transthoracic pressure. So this is the pressure between your alveolar space and the body surface. Okay, alveolar space, so all the way deep down in the alveoli versus that pressure that the atmosphere is pushing against your body. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, number 3 is your transpulmonary pressure. So you're dealing with alveolar space and pleural space. So think about the alveoli, and then you also have the pleural space. So the pleural cavity exerting pressure against where the alveoli are. Okay, and last but not least, you have your transrespiratory pressure, which is basically your pie hole, your airway opening, and your body surface. Okay, so transrespiratory pressure is dealing with that, and there is a really good YouTube video on that, which I will link in Google Classroom for you guys. So don't worry about it if you're not understanding these pressure gradients. I think this guy does a good job, but again, these are a little bit confusing because of the terminology. So you're going to have to try to understand. Hopefully, the YouTube video does explain it much better. Okay, so here is the diagram that I was talking about inside your Pilbeams book. So it tells you the different types of pressures. So you'll see right here, there the airway pressure, alveolar pressure. So, and then you'll have these brackets that just tells you the different types of gradients. Okay, what gradients are involved in those particular pressures. Okay. So this one, we were talking about the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure, how this one, it'll start to 0, it'll dip down to negative 5, go back to 0. That's the intrapulmonary pressure. And then your intrapleural, okay, so that is dealing with the different layers, the parietal and visceral, I believe. That is going from negative 5 to a negative 10. Again, we are negative pressure breathers, and this is how we generate the negative pressure so that our lungs can expand. So when we're looking at inspiration, you're seeing a lot of negative pressure. This looks like it's within the pleural cavity or the pleural space that helps pull the air into the lungs, and it expands the lungs as well. Now you got to remember, you got pressures exerting here. You have pressure exerting from the pleural cavity to the most likely the parietal and visceral layers of the lungs. And inside you have the alveolar pressure, so you have pressures pushing against where the alveolar are. Okay, so when we talk about exhalation, now we have much more pressure in the lungs versus the atmosphere. So again, we go from a place of high pressure to low pressure. So we generate so much pressure in the lungs to the point where we get to breathe out. Okay, and sometimes our muscles do help. Our diaphragm helps. It pushes in. And all these pressures exert against the lungs, causing air flow to move out. Okay, so that's why you have here, it'll say a negative 10 goes up to a negative 5 because we are pushing some pressures out. So when we talk about lung characteristics, and we've talked about this in class already, now you have compliance versus elastance. Compliance is basically just how easy the lungs distend or they stretch. Okay, emphysema is basically floppy lungs. Your lungs are just so floppy that the compliance is so high, right? Because it's so easy to inflate them. But since they're floppy, they can't get back to normal. Or that's a great segue to talk about elastance, which is the lungs trying to get back into its original shape or form. With emphysema lungs, you can't do that. It's so floppy, it'll expand easily, but the elastance is not there, so it won't bounce back to its normal shape. It just kind of hangs out. Okay, and what's cool is that in lab I do have some emphysemic lungs, so we can play with them floppy lungs, and you guys can try to adjust the ventilators and blood gases based on a restrictive and floppy lungs. So I think that's going to be really awesome. So when we talk about compliance, we're also talking about a change in volume and a change in pressure. Okay, on your exam, if I give you the change in volume and pressure, you will utilize that equation. The C, which is your compliance, equals a change in volume and change in pressure. Okay, I might even give you the compliance, and I might give you one of the others. Like I can give you compliance and volume or compliance and pressure. You will have to algebraically solve for that and then go ahead and calculate to find the variable. Okay, so again, normal compliance, it is in the sheet of normal values that I gave you in lab. So you have those there, and I included them here in the slide for you to have, so that if you happen to be scanning certain chapters like chapter 1 and you see this, it should spark some memory for you to memorize. Okay, so we're talking about static compliance. Now in lab we talked about pressing the inspiratory pause or inspiratory hold button to determine our plateau pressure. Okay, that plateau pressure is going to be important in calculating our static compliance. So as you can see here in red, this is our formula for static compliance, which is your tidal volume divided by the difference of your plateau pressure minus PEEP. Now again in class, if you see just EEP and expiratory pressure, that means the baseline is at 0. Okay, and on the exam, if you see the word baseline, if the question says baseline is at 5, that means it's talking about PEEP. Okay, so if they say the baseline is 0, that's your EEP without the P. And expiratory pressure, it's not positive because it's not above 0. Okay, hopefully that you understand that concept. Okay, so it's in red, so know how to calculate static compliance. So then we're talking about resistance in terms of airways. Okay, so now you have your trans airway pressure divided by flow. Now your trans airway pressure is the same, and I think it's in another slide, but it's basically the same as your PIP minus plateau. Okay, and we'll take a look at that in the slides to come. So normal airway resistance I have listed here. We have the unintubated patient and the intubated patient. Okay, so remember, we're talking about airway resistance, we're talking about flow, we are talking about liters per second. Okay, I don't know how many times I've got to stress that you have to convert from liters to minute to liters per second and then make your final calculations to find your airway resistance. So again, here is our trans airway pressure. That just equates to your PIP minus plateau. So when we look at the slide before, you're looking at your PTA divided by the flow. We can substitute the trans airway pressure with PIP minus plateau. Okay, so when we talk about airway resistance, now it is PIP minus plateau divided by the flow. Okay, that's how I remember it. It kind of rhymes. All right, I'm a poet and I didn't even know it. So here is an example. Okay, so I have a flow set at 60 liters per minute. Peak inspiratory pressure is 40. Plateau is 25. So here we just throw in PTA. Trans airway pressure is therefore 15. Now where did I get the 15? 40 minus 25. Okay, now here's the kicker. So I have flow is converted from liters per minute to liters per second. So I have a flow of 60 liters per minute divided by 60 seconds. That gives me 1 liter per second, which is beautiful in mathematics because it's whatever the numerator is divided by 1. And that gives you, sorry guys, and that gives you a 1. So you get 15 centimeters of water pressure of airway resistance. Okay, so you can utilize this and you can practice that for your mathematics. And sometimes you might have a flow of 40, you might have a flow of 50. So start looking at calculating flow based on maybe 50 and 40 liters per minute. Convert that to seconds. The more you do it, the more you'll probably start to memorize it, and the more that when you see, let's say 40 liters per minute, you automatically know how many that is per second. So that might be one way to practice and maybe study on how to calculate airway resistance. All right, so now you have something called time constants. Is it going to be on the exam? I don't think so, but it's here. So briefly talking about it, time constants is dealing with how long will it take for the lung units to fill and to empty. That's about it. So based on our graphics here, graphic A, this is pretty normal standard curve. Okay, so this middle one, it's showing more of a increase in, or should I say a decrease in static compliance. So notice if it's harder to stretch the alveoli, or the lung units as they call it, you will notice that there's a decrease in volume. Okay, so if I have a decrease in volume, I'm definitely going to have an increase in pressure, and you'll start to see that that your peak inspiratory pressures will start to rise and alarm. Okay, so that means your lungs are getting stiff. So then your pressure start rising, then you would have to start thinking about switching them to pressure control. Okay, so and also too, if you have airways that are much narrower, okay, it's gonna take more time to fill in the lung units. Okay, so let's say if I have swelling in the bronchioles, or I might have some boogers, right? As some people have said, instead of mucus, they say boogers. You got boogers in the smaller branches of the airways leading to the alveoli. Those boogers can create high airway resistance, so less air will start filling the alveoli to the point where it's going to take more time for the alveoli to really get a maximum amount of, I guess you can say, stretch. Okay, so that's where your time constants come in. So based on this graphic, so one time constant, the alveoli will roughly fill about 63%. Okay, on inspiration, and then on expiration, volumes and pressures, 36.8 are starting to go out. So depending on how you look at this, so if it's at 0, you're looking at the inspiratory limb of the time constant graph. So at one time constant, it fills 63%. Two time constants will be 86. 3 will be 95, 4, 5, and 6 respectively. So when you're looking at the expiratory volume, so as you're blowing out, the first time constant, 36.8% is left, then 13.55, and then now you have 0.02 after 6 time constants of the expiratory volume will be left. Okay. And again, with time constants, I spoke with Mr. Fuentes. It's not on the NBRC exam, but it's here, and you might run into it in homework, so it's good that you know it. Again, here's the time constants without the graphical format. So it just tells you 60% of the volume to be inhaled. So mostly this is just on inhalation only. So types of mechanical ventilators, I mean, we've been going through this for quite some time. You have your negative pressure ventilation, which is your iron lung or your chest curus. You have your positive pressure ventilation, which is your invasive or non-invasive. And then you have your high frequency ventilation, which is more for the chillins. Okay, so as negative pressure breathers, this is the anatomical way we breathe. Okay, so we generate negative force in here. Now this is just a manometer measuring the pressures. So normally we generate a negative pressure. Now when I say negative pressure or positive pressure, this is pressure within the lungs as opposed to the atmosphere. Okay, so if I generate a negative pressure, that means I'm pulling air in. It's like I'm creating a vacuum. All right, and so when I create that negative pressure, I start pulling in air into my lungs. Okay, and then your diaphragm as well as the stretch of your lungs create that negative pressure. Okay. So when we're talking about positive pressure, it's more of air just being pushed into our lungs. Okay, there's no negative force being generated. You know, think about like bellows, think about a vacuum. Nothing's creating that. With the bellows, you pull outward, it creates that negative pressure. Well, let's just say our bellows aren't working. So I have it, I'm holding on to it, I'm just sitting there with it, it's not creating. So someone's got to blow inside the bellows. Okay, and so that's basically what positive pressure is. We're just shooting air into the lungs. And it's not us anatomically creating that negative pressure. It's a machine pushing air into our lungs. Okay. And then high frequency ventilation, there's different types of it. I've seen high frequency ventilation more on children, peds, and neonates. And we really don't touch on these types of ventilations. I think in 240 you will. But I just wanted to show that you guys are there. Now, again, we talked about baseline pressure. Baseline pressure doesn't necessarily mean 0. Okay, so if I have a baseline pressure of +5, baseline is basically the same thing as your PEEP, or in this case in the photo it's at 0, so that would be your EEP. Okay, that's the PEEP without the first P. Okay, we talked about this is the inspiration lib in terms of pressure. This is a pressure over time, so this is a pressure scalar graph. Okay, so in inspiration, we do a pause, an inspiratory pause, we get our plateau pressure. So you have your PIP, plat, and then your baseline would be your PEEP or EEP. Okay, so when we talk about PEEP, we're talking about how much pressure is at the end of exhalation. Okay, so, and you guys already have been, you guys know about PEEP already. So, but then anyway, PEEP is technically your baseline, or at the end of an expiration, that is how much pressure is left in the lungs to generate alveolar recruitment. Okay, and then again, you can see here you have your PIP and plateau, and then on top of that, you also have a spontaneous inspiration. Okay, so this spontaneous inspiration is basically what the patient is breathing. Now you'll see this little dip. This is the patient generating a negative pressure to breathe. Now, as you can see, this is a spontaneous expiration, so there's not as much pressure coming up from here. Okay, but so this is more of a passive expiration. Okay, so when we talk about peak pressures, that is the highest pressure that the lungs will have at the end of inspiration. Okay, peak pressure, or PIP, peak inspiratory pressure. Okay, so remember, if your peak pressure rises, okay, and your plateau stays the same, that means you only have an increase in airway resistance. All right, and so what causes that? It could be someone biting on the ET tubes. You're going to have a lot of mucus, right? You're going to have a lot of boogers in the upper airways, or you might have some bronchospasms. So the way we fix airway resistance is we suction, we give a treatment, or we tell the patient, yo man, stop biting on the tube. Okay? So when we talk about plateau pressures, that is how much pressure is in the alveoli at the end of inspiration. Okay, so again, it's dealing with a static movement of air, meaning to say there's no air moving at all. It's just stuck in the lungs, and so the ventilator measures how much pressure is left in the lungs without any type of movement. Versus dynamic compliance, it's going to deal with a lot of air movement as well as the stillness of the alveoli when you try to calculate the plateau pressure. Okay, so if you have your peak pressure starts to rise and your plateau starts to rise, that means you have a decrease in compliance, meaning to say it's harder for the lungs to expand. So when we start looking at that, you'll start to see peak pressures rising. So this is where you're going to have to start thinking about putting the patient on pressure control. Now remember, our number for pressure control is 30, meaning to say 30 centimeters of water pressure is our max that we want to keep the pressure the patient on. So if I have a PIP, let's say if I have a patient on volume control and the PIP is hitting 30s, I might start getting worried, because if it starts getting 31, 32, that's a high pressure. Okay, and if they're constantly up there 40s, 50s, something's definitely wrong. Instead of sitting there like trying to look at solving the problem, switch the patient to pressure control. Control that pressure first, and then start looking. Is it a dislodged endotracheal tube? Is it a dislodged trach tube? something like that. You can investigate after you control that pressure. So again, we have the terminology intrinsic PEEP, air trapping, or auto PEEP. It means the same thing. Now you'll come across something called extrinsic PEEP. Extrinsic PEEP is when the therapist, the RT, the doctor, whoever orders, they're the ones that puts in the PEEP. So that is extrinsic versus intrinsic, where the body will trap the air itself. Okay? So again, when we have ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and I'll talk about the pathophysiology of that next week, but when you have ARDS, just remember that you will have elevated plateau pressure. Why? Because you're going to have a decreased compliance. Why? Because the lungs are going to get stiff. And that could just be through some type of infection, or it could be some type of, but just something that's going on in the lungs. And that's it, ladies and gents. That is chapter 1. I hope you've enjoyed this tour down compliance and raw lane. Go ahead and just, again, focus on the red, because that is what's on the exam. So hopefully this helps you guys. Thank you so much for listening and making it to the very end. And I will catch you on the next one.